Hi, I'm Paul, and this is Production. This weekend, I got to see another April movie that really blew me away. I can't believe we've had 2 good movies in a month. I can't remember the last time that's happened. Obviously, Warfare was incredible. The Amateur was fine, but Sinners is the movie I saw today on its release day, and this movie blew me away. I don't know if I can put it a way that's specific to Sinners, but it was a movie that I thought was unlike anything I've seen in a long time. It was completely its own thing and totally deserving of the word unique. Ryan Coogler, the director, has made a bunch of cool stuff. He did Creed, which is extremely effective. He did Black Panther, which, once again, extremely effective. Fruitvale Station, Wakanda Forever. This is his first movie where he's writing and directing the movie. It was shot on IMAX cameras, and it was really something else. It's about the blues. It's about reckoning with your past. It's about relationships. It's about sex. It's about vampires. It's about the devil you know versus the devil you don't. It's such a multifaceted movie, and one of the few movies I've seen in the last 6 months to a year where I was completely swept up from probably moment one till the very end. So in this video, I'm going to talk about my experience of Preachers. I'm going to talk about what worked for me, the very, very few things that didn't work for me, and then near the end, I want to discuss a part of it that I'll have to kind of spoil, so we'll put a little spoiler warning before that to break from my format of not chopping up my videos. But man, just if you don't know the plot, Michael B. Jordan plays twins who, having been in Chicago doing business, return to their small town in the South to open up a juke joint, which I guess would be the Southern equivalent of a speakeasy of the time in 1932. The film opens taking place on my birthday, which I think is really weird, but maybe it's just me connecting dots that aren't there. This movie, I feel like, gets sold as a vampire movie, and the first and only trailer I ever saw for it was Michael B. Jordan talking to himself, you know, the 2 characters, and then a shot with a machine gun. Those are all I really remember from the trailer, but I remember being completely uninterested in it. I thought to myself, this is what the guy who did Black Panther is doing. He's doing some weird, violent period piece, and having seen the trailer, I don't think I connected that it was about vampires. I thought maybe a gangster film of some kind, and I really wasn't interested. But when you actually watch the movie, it has such a good way of getting you into what's happening. There's 40 or so minutes, I didn't really count, but 40 or so minutes of building this world of Michael B. Jordan's 2 characters, their cousin Sammy, who I think his nickname is Preacher Boy or something like that, who's a guitar player, the 2 separate lovers that Michael B. Jordan's separate characters had and their pasts with them, the community around them that both loves them and fears them, and then by the time you're into the meat of the movie, which isn't even the action stuff, you have this rich world behind you and you really care a lot about the characters. And that's something I think that is tough because a lot of audiences don't want to see just talky dramas. I've kind of, within my circle of friends, I'm kind of known for liking really talky dramas and melodrama that doesn't have a lot of action or like story movement to it. And this just, it provides that as a base for the violence that is later to come in the movie. And that gives you the sense that the violence is so much more impactful. There's a couple kills and deaths later in the movie that I found myself choking up because of. And around that time, there's a couple periods of surrealism in the movie that last maybe between 10 and 45 seconds each that are really, really effective because of all that world building that you spend time doing. But yeah, there's so much about this movie I want to discuss. So let's talk about what worked first. So what worked best for me in this movie was there's this kind of undercurrent of, and Ryan Coogler's really good with this, but there's this undercurrent of musicality to everything that happens. There's blues playing both diegetically and extra diegetically. There's sound cues that you don't really expect. Maybe if you don't know me, you don't know how I feel about the world, but like, I'm not a racist person, but it seems racist to say this. You don't expect a kind of Ghost sounding, like the band Ghost, you don't expect a music cue that sounds like Ghost in a black-led, black-directed movie. And there's a few sound cues like that, like kind of almost sludge metal or doom metal that kind of come later in the movie you don't really expect. But there's so much music to it in general, and one of the central pieces of the movie is a musical piece where one of the characters goes to perform in front of a crowd for the first time, someone who is a musician. And a lot of the characters are musicians, especially blues musicians. One of the characters is a singer. There's so much music to it, and as someone who loves music being used effectively in a movie, I was just swept up in that alone. Even before they started building the characters, honestly, I just love like Steven Soderbergh's use of music. I love the way Paul Thomas Anderson is always working with that one guy from Radiohead. I love the way David Fincher uses Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. It's just, music makes a movie so much more immersive, and this movie really uses it to the fullest extent of its possibilities. As far as, I don't really think I noticed a lot of score, but I did notice a lot of music. And that brings me to another thing, is that until a certain point in the movie, a lot of the music feels, even though it is meant to be diegetic, it feels like the actors really know what they're doing. They're actually playing their instruments, or they're actually singing, or at least acting like they're singing very well. And it always is going to make me immerse myself in a movie world more if the music seems accurate. That's part of the reason the Bob Dylan movie from this last year worked so well for me, is that it feels like Timothée Chalamet is actually playing the guitar and like he's using his voice to sing based on the vocalization he arrived at for the talking points of Bob Dylan. But music worked really well. The violence worked really well, and I understand, shooting in IMAX, that means you're shooting on film, and it's very tough to choreograph and execute violence well. We've seen that. I think Every Frame of Painting maybe made a comment about how American movies versus Chinese movies, the violence in American movies, they'll kind of cut before a very important point in the violence, and therefore it looks like the violence has a lot less impact. Like, you'll see a fist going in, and then you'll cut before the fist hits, and you'll see the retraction of the fist, and you won't ever see a connection. And so violence is really hard to do, and this movie has a lot of combination between really intimate violence where you're with two characters as they're being violent towards one another, and a lot of kind of far away gun type violence that really is effective. But violence worked really well. The next thing that worked really well, I think, is the interpersonal relationships, and I think that's partly because you get to see them built for that first 40 minutes. The interpersonal relationships in this movie are so intense and so fraught with this negative past. I think both of Michael B. Jordan's characters have lovers that either feel jilted by them or that they shared a tragedy with of some kind, and you feel that history, and they don't treat you like modern audiences often get treated. They don't explain word for word, like this happened and this happened and this happened. It's like, no, here's how we're feeling about this thing that you can pretty much guess almost exactly what it was. And I think Haley Steinfeld's jilted lover character, she does explain a couple things, maybe a little bit too caustically or specifically, that happened between her and one of Michael B. Jordan's characters. But other than that, you really feel this sense of history. People know them when they go into town. People know them by reputation, but then others know them positively by reputation. It's this really great world building exercise. And like I mentioned before, as you get to the points where violence has to happen, where tension has to happen, those two things are so much more effective because you get to see from a place of, I feel like I know this character because they built them up for 40 minutes or so. The next thing I think that worked really well is there's this kind of, I don't know how to describe it without sounding silly, but there's this weird horniness to the movie that I don't feel like a lot of movies translate super well. Like when I think of a horny movie, I don't think of movies where there's a lot of nudity or sex or anything like that. I feel like movies where there's the opposite is where I feel it's most effective. My favorite example of this is Bull Durham. There's so much sexual tension and almost no sexual release. And in fact, when there is sexual release, it's meant to signify that a character has broken in a way. Like when Kevin Costner and Susan Sarandon finally get together, it's like, oh, he kind of, you know, the relationship between all these characters is completely broken. So I guess the horniness in this movie really works well because there's people having sex, but that's not what's horny about it. There's this tension so many ways between different characters who do have a history, characters who don't have a history, and it kind of just adds this fifth dimension to the movie that you don't really get often. I feel like a lot of movies that I watch that get solo released on VOD or Netflix or whatever, they don't have a lot of layers to the relationships, and there's some characters where their only relationship is this physical attraction that they're building, and there's other characters where this physical attraction underlies their history and the tragedies they experience together and the fact that they can't stop coming back to one another or other things like that. So those things I think are the things that work most for me. The violence, like I said, is just really cool, and the music is so beautiful, and I don't know, blues, you know, makes up a lot of our modern music kind of structure and chord changes and stuff like that. So having a movie that's about the fictionalized versions of these people who just wanted to perform and wanted to express themselves before music became this commercialized thing, I think is a really beautiful backdrop to set something horrifying up against. I guess I mentioned it briefly, but I didn't fully get into it. The thing that worked the most for me is the fact that this movie doesn't treat its audience like they're stupid. There's this point, and I don't think this is spoiling anything, there's this point where a vampire is trying to enter a building, and they ask repeatedly if the person at the door is gonna let them in. And before that, there's been no mention of vampires, no mention of anything supernatural with the exception of this one kind of herbalist character. And the person at the door won't say, "Come on in." And it doesn't, nobody says, like I would expect in a modern movie them to say, "Oh, they're vampires, they can't come in unless you invite them." They don't ever really say that. They kind of just look at each other, you know, like, "Oh, we're not going to be saying that phrase, so let's all just kind of tacitly agree we're not going to say it." So it treats the audience, like I said before, like we actually can read into visual cues and shot design and stuff like that. And I thought that was really refreshing because not a lot of movies do that. But going on from there, I think maybe there's a couple things that didn't really work for me. There's one sex scene that kind of mirrors a sex scene that you see a lot in TV and movies. The thing that I think of is Rustin Cole and Marty's wife. It kind of mirrors that scene, if you know what I'm talking about, without spoiling this or True Detective. That scene, once it got past a certain point in the sexual act, just felt a little bit maybe awkward, and I don't think they needed to go as far into the sex as they did in that. The horniness was like very palpable in that scene. But there's that, there's, I don't think it's spoiling anything to say that the music plays a big part in it. So there's a point after about the halfway mark where certain characters, you can tell they're not playing their instruments, don't know what the points in the song to change the chord shapes of their hands. That's always going to be something I nitpick about because I love music and I've played guitar for, off and on 15 years or so. There's a little bit of kind of schlocky vampire stuff at the very, very end of the vampire part of the movie without spoiling anything once again. But other than that, I feel like 95% of this movie works super well. It's a really well-crafted piece of cinema, and the only problem I would say is that I've heard tell that some people didn't buy in. And that's kind of always one of my big complaints when it comes to movies I love, is that if you don't buy in, you can't live in the world of the movie and you can't have fun in the world of the movie. So take Ocean's 12, for example. That's probably one of my favorite movies, and if you don't buy into the premise of the movie and the conceits that they ask you to bring as a viewer, then the whole movie could just not work for you and you'd be sitting there like, this is craziness. But this movie kind of has the same thing. Like, if by the end of that 40 minutes where they're explaining all the characters and stuff like that and building this world for you, if by the end of that time you haven't bought in, then there's a pretty decent chunk of the middle and end that you might find difficult to watch. And so I think, that's tough because a lot of audiences I find aren't willing to just live in the world of a movie and have fun with that movie. And if you do that with this, it's incredible. But if you don't do that, it's impossible to sit with. I can see, I guess, why some audiences haven't enjoyed certain aspects of this movie. When it comes to how I feel about the movie's life in theaters and on VOD and the rights and stuff like that, I've listened to a couple interviews with Ryan Coogler before I saw the movie, and in fact, those are what drove me to see the movie, is just listening to him talk about it and nerd out with certain interviewers about movie technology and stuff like that. I feel like the big thing for this is going to be word of mouth, because a lot of people online have expressed disinterest in seeing the movie, or there's enough detractors of repute that it could detract from the movie's overall performance. But I would love for this movie to make money, because I want more original movies. I want people who write their own movies and then direct them to be given more blank checks, for lack of a better word, to do stuff like that. And I don't know, I think that as someone who wants to make movies myself and who has a couple really ambitious projects, part of me is thinking, this could be a big inflection point for original films, because the idea of making movies for profit, I think, is over. I think the era of Steven Spielberg being this kind of like celebrity director is over, and that's a dream that a lot of directors are sold in film school and on social media and stuff. But that doesn't diminish the fact that making a movie is a really crazy, beautiful undertaking, and I want more people to be able to do that. And I want people to be able to do that on a smaller level and then be given funding to do that on a larger level, because when you are able to spend money to shoot something on film, which entails potentially, not exactly, but potentially better lighting people and more specific camera people and more specialized jobs on set, I think that's really beautiful, and I want people to be able to do that, because that to me is the crux of the art form. And what I worry is that film is becoming like Broadway, where I think a good play and specifically a good musical is a really beautiful thing to behold, and I've been in a bunch of plays and musicals and it's fun to be in them. But the state of the industry of Broadway is that a lot of the best original material is self-referential. It's referencing Broadway. And I guess to pull an easy example of this that's not modern is The Producers. That is about in-jokes with regard to Broadway. It's about in-jokes with regard to the audience and the conventions of plays, and plays with those conventions in order to break from some of them, and blah, blah, blah. And the same thing exists in movies with things that became cult classics like Tropic Thunder. If you've never been on a film set before, I can see a lot of the jokes in Tropic Thunder maybe flying over your head, but I don't want the movie industry to end up like that. So yeah, I don't want the industry to become this self-referential, you have to be part of the industry to get the joke, to enjoy the thing type of thing. And if people don't get to make more movies like this, then that type of thing is going to be what the industry becomes. It's going to be schlock entertainment mimicking the attention spans of social media and self-referential stuff that you have to be a part of the industry to get. And then, I mean, you kind of see that with a lot of the award shows, like a lot of it is this self-referential thing, whereas I think in the past they maybe tried to appeal to a wider audience. But this movie being successful, along with a lot of the other original written and directed movies this year potentially being successful, is a big inflection point, because if we want audiences to go back to movies and to enjoy them, we have to respect audiences, we have to make more original movies, and we have to take chances on original movies that are going to have larger budgets. So maybe in the future we bring back the $8 million, $10 million movie, but right now it seems like everything is low budget or high budget, and it's a toss-up whether people actually go to see it. So that's tough for the movie industry, but this I think could be a big way to kind of undo a lot of the damage that has been done to the movies in the last 4 years, especially the damage with regard to audiences not being respected. So I guess at this point it's good to maybe say spoiler warning, because I want to talk about 2 specific sequences that friends of mine expressed reticence about. And so from this point forward, we are going to be spoiling this movie. So a lot of people have talked about how they heard this movie was a musical or something like that. And I guess in a way it has elements of that, but I don't think that's entirely accurate to say. I think there are a couple points in the movie near the middle and near the kind of last third of the movie where the blend between diegetic sound and extra diegetic sound mixing makes it feel as if there are elements of a musical, but it's so much more than that. I guess the first point of those is Preacher Boy, who we find out early in the movie wants to be a blues guitarist, goes on stage to perform for a crowd at this venue that Michael B. Jordan's 2 characters open up. And when he starts playing, it becomes this massive, what looks to be motion control camera move, but I don't think you can really accomplish motion control super easily with an IMAX camera, so I'm really curious to eventually find out how they did that. But it looks like this single motion controlled camera move throughout the venue with all these people dancing and all these people enjoying themselves, and then it blends in with his guitar playing and singing, essentially like the history of music up to that point and where maybe blues came from and where certain other cultural things that are being experienced in that space came from, with the future of music from that point on and where blues maybe went to, and where specifically, I don't even know if you want to restrict it to blues, where specifically like black music went to. So you see people with what look to be like ancient African versions of guitars. You see people in ancient Chinese kind of traditional garb, or like what looks to be maybe Chinese opera type garb. You see a character that looks very similar to Bootsy Collins playing a Flying V electric guitar, and his kind of solo on that guitar is extra diegetically mixed into the song that the guy's playing on stage. You see someone with turntables, you see people dancing, you see one lady twerking. It's like kind of this mishmash of what's happening in the scene and what will be happening in the future and what was happening in the past. And it's kind of this mix of, first off, it's the first time in the movie where we really get into surreal territory. And from that point on, there's a few points of surreality, like I mentioned, that make the movie very interesting. And then second of all, the mixing on this part of the movie is so fantastic. If you're an audiophile, if you like music, which Ryan Coogler obviously has amazing taste in music and has put together some of the better soundtracks of the last 10 years, this is a really special point in the movie. But if you're not bought in, like I mentioned, to the movie by this point, it's a point where the movie could potentially lose you right before some of the more interesting stuff happens. So it's a real risk to put that where it is, but I thought it was fantastic. It's really fucking cool how they did that. And that point of surreality kind of blends into the next point of surreality, which is, the roof is on fire metaphorically, but also in the frame, the camera tilts up and the roof is on fire, and all of a sudden the entire venue is on fire and the vampires can see through the venue because they're experiencing this music with the people who are actually in the venue itself. I thought that was so well done and cool, and it was almost like Ryan Coogler saying, listen, I love music, I'm just gonna put a really cool musical concept in the middle of this and let people either buy it or not buy it. And I bought it because I like buying into movies. It's just more fun that way. And it just worked completely for me. I don't know why I loved it, but I just could not get enough. I thought it was so cool. And the next point is, like in the musical kind of thing we're talking about, is I don't think you really get this sense until you see this point, because there's some dialogue later where they talk about it, but you don't really get this sense until you reach this point. There's another musical point in the movie where the vampires are all standing outside of the venue, and by this point there are many more of them because they've bitten some people, they've invaded some homes, stuff like that. And the main vampire, the kind of main bad guy in this part of the movie, is singing, I thought it was a fucking Flogging Molly song, but apparently it's like a more kind of traditional adjacent Irish song. And that piece of singing gets joined in by the rest of the vampires, and as they're joining in, the extra diegetic sound mixing kind of joins in eventually as well, and then they're all dancing their own little musical number, and it becomes a similar thing to what happened in the club. But those are 2 minute to 2 minute long sequences in the entire movie, and I don't think that qualifies it as a musical. I just think Ryan Coogler is really good at doing stuff with musical stuff, and that happened to work just as well, but in a different way, as the performance that turned into a bigger thing. So I don't think you could call it a musical. I think that it has musical elements, but that's not what the movie is. It's about people, like all movies are. So I don't think calling it a musical is a fair critique or criticism or even comment. It's just something that people who lack the ability to buy in and enjoy something might say about this. The next thing I want to talk about in terms of spoilers is like the kind of culture aspect. And Ryan Coogler does really well about injecting culture into his movies in a way that's accessible for everyone. And there's a point at the kind of tail end of the movie where one of Michael B. Jordan's characters is talking to the main vampire, and he starts praying. And not a lot of talk of oppression in this movie, but there is the sense that, oh, these people are sharecroppers, they're living in Jim Crow, they probably don't have a lot of ability to be mobile in society, they can't go to just any random city and just live there, but it doesn't, it kind of just makes you experience that. It doesn't say a lot of that. Like, I think the word sharecropper is maybe said once. And there's a point where Michael B. Jordan starts praying, I think he says the Our Father to the main vampire, and the main vampire is kind of like, yeah, that's a prayer that he says in kind of a more Irish accent. Like, that's a prayer that my people heard when we were being oppressed. That prayer has no effect on me, essentially, and in fact, it might even imbue me with a little bit of hatred or resentment. And that sort of like, kind of, hey, we all come from this point where we're trying to get past oppression. I think maybe that's a simplification, but you know what I'm trying to say, is a really good way of kind of injecting that cultural sensibility that his movies are known for, that just makes you think a little bit and makes you feel like, okay, there's even another layer to this, even if it's not talked directly about every other line of the movie. I feel like one of the traps movies fall into is they want to talk about something, and whoever makes the movie feels the only way to actually talk about something is to use the words of the characters to talk about it. And in this movie, it's so beautifully shown and experienced, and maybe someone will say something like, I want to move to X or Y city because it seems like you guys had X or Y level of success there, and the character will be like, no, it's the same, it's just the people don't say like, hey boy, or whatever. It's like the same kind of people, they have the same attitudes, they're just, you know, on their high horse because they didn't like slavery or something. And they'll kind of dismissively say something that is really deep in the way that you do in a real conversation when someone's being naive. It's just, maybe this conversation isn't meant to talk about the politics that the movie might be written, you know, under the backdrop of. Maybe this conversation is about this one character is naive and this other character has a little bit more experience. So that cultural aspect, I think, is kind of injected really well. And specifically, there's a couple culture things that I found interesting. There's one of the characters is kind of an herbalist and puts together these really kind of in the dark, you don't really know what they are, concoctions for X, Y, and Z, and they end up being kind of a Chekhov's gun in the rest of the movie where, oh, that person also happens to know what a vampire is, and they know, let's splash them with garlic water or whatever. That part was really interesting, and that person, I know from listening to the interview with Ryan Coogler, also did some sort of mystical practice in the middle of the movie where they're kind of trying to see how everything's gonna turn out, and they kind of have this worried look on their face, like, you know, and that, I don't know, maybe, I don't know what I'm trying to say about it. It just, I loved that aspect of the movie because I've had medical problems my whole life, and a sort of mystical herbalist, if for lack of a better word, I guess, is what brought me out of those medical problems and into health. So that's another really cool aspect of the movie that I would rather not discuss until I've said their spoilers, because I want people to go in blind and just buy in, because that's the special thing about movies, is just buying in. But yeah, this movie I think is really special. It's really beautifully shot, it's beautifully acted. The music is great. The action sequences are really fun for the most part. And then you get this kind of button at the end of the movie, which that's another kind of spoilers. There's a post-credit sequence that is maybe suggests there might be a sequel, which would be really cool based on what they did with the post-credit sequence, to see a sequel that is based around that post-credit sequence. But it's just a really special movie with so much to it. I feel like in thinking about the last several minutes of talking about it, I couldn't even say that I did it justice. It's just such a fun movie, and I hope people go to see it because it's, I don't know, the future of movies is on the line, and people need to go back to seeing movies. That's pretty much what it is. So yeah, I would definitely recommend checking this out. Obviously, as you probably know, you want to see movies in the first few weeks of them being in theaters for maximum filmmaker benefit and points benefit, if anyone did have points on this movie, but just see it in general. It just like Warfare, it's a movie that really begets a good theatrical experience, especially because of the sound mixing and being shot on IMAX cameras and that beautiful, just color-rich depth of being on film is just so great. So yeah, go see this. I would love to know what you thought of it. If you want to share in the comments, it's really gorgeous. And I want to know if you had any nitpicks that I maybe didn't bring up, because I'm sure that if you brought up a good point, I might kind of enjoy it or agree with you. But I just really think this is a good month for movies in a good year for movies, or what is kind of promising to be a good year for movies. So that's my experience with Sinners. I hope that you had a good time listening to this if you saw the movie. If you haven't seen the movie, I would be eager to know what you think I missed, what you think I should have touched a little bit more on, and maybe we'll be talking about some more movies next month or later this month. Depends on how crazy we're feeling with our theater trips. So, all right, see you next time.